The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked earth of Samuel Crawford's ranch, painting the barren landscape in shades of amber and dust. He stood on his porch, weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the notice that would change everything. The bank's foreclosure letter fluttered in the dry wind like a death sentence, its official seal mocking him with every gust. At 42, Samuel had spent half his life trying to make something of the 300 acres his father had left him. The Crawford Ranch had once been prosperous, with cattle dotting the rolling hills and crops swaying in fields that now lay fallow. But 3 years of drought had turned his green paradise into a wasteland, and the few remaining cattle were nothing more than walking skeletons, their ribs showing through patchy hide. Samuel crushed the letter in his fist and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the parched grass. Inside, the building echoed with emptiness where dozens of animals had once lived. Only 3 cows remained, and he knew they wouldn't last another month without rain or money for feed. His truck, a rust-colored Ford that had seen better decades, sat silent in the corner, its gas tank empty because he couldn't afford to fill it. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the morning silence. Samuel stepped outside to see a cloud of dust rising from the dirt road that led to his property. As the dust settled, a black sedan emerged, sleek and out of place against the rural backdrop. 2 men in expensive suits climbed out, their polished shoes immediately collecting dust as they approached. "Mr. Crawford," the taller man extended a manicured hand. "I'm Richard Blackwood, and this is my associate, Mr. Hayes. We represent several business interests in the area." Samuel shook the offered hand cautiously. "If you're here about buying the land, you're wasting your time. I'm not selling." Blackwood smiled, but there was something cold in his expression. "Actually, Mr. Crawford, we're here to discuss an opportunity. We understand you're facing some financial difficulties, and we might have a solution that could benefit everyone involved." Hayes opened a briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. "There's an auction happening in town today, a special kind of auction that might interest someone in your position." Samuel's jaw tightened. "What kind of auction?" "Indentured servants," Blackwood said matter-of-factly. "People who have accumulated debts they can't pay, offering their labor to settle their obligations. It's perfectly legal, and it might be exactly what you need to get back on your feet." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He'd heard rumors of such arrangements, whispered conversations about desperate people selling themselves into temporary servitude to escape crushing debt. The practice existed in legal gray areas, preying on those who had nowhere else to turn. "I'm not interested in owning people," Samuel said firmly. "You wouldn't own them," Hayes interjected. "Think of it as a partnership. They work for room and board while paying off their debts, and you get the labor you need to revive your ranch. Everyone benefits." Samuel looked back at his dying property, then at the foreclosure notice still crumpled in his hand. How much would something like this cost? Blackwood's smile widened. "For someone with your particular financial situation, we could arrange something very reasonable, perhaps even a payment plan." The conversation continued for another hour, with the 2 men painting pictures of renewed prosperity and second chances. They spoke of young, hardworking individuals eager for honest employment and the opportunity to start fresh. Samuel found himself listening despite his moral reservations, desperation making their words sound more reasonable than they should have. After the men left, Samuel sat alone on his porch as the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. The silence was broken only by the occasional lowing of his remaining cattle and the whistle of wind through the empty barn. He thought about his father, who had built this ranch from nothing, working 18-hour days to create something lasting for his family. The old man had died believing his son would carry on the legacy. Samuel walked through the house, his footsteps echoing in rooms that had once been filled with life. In the kitchen, he opened cabinets to find them mostly bare. A few cans of beans, some stale crackers, and a bag of coffee that would last maybe another week. His bank account held less than $200, not enough to buy feed for the cattle, let alone save the ranch. He found himself standing in what had once been his parents' bedroom, now converted into his office. The walls were covered with photographs of better times, cattle drives, harvest festivals, family gatherings that seemed like scenes from another life. On the desk sat a stack of unpaid bills, each one a reminder of how far he'd fallen. The sound of his neighbor's truck pulling up the driveway interrupted his brooding. Margaret Wilson, a 60-year-old widow who owned the adjacent property, climbed out with a basket in her hands. She'd been checking on Samuel regularly since his troubles began, offering what help she could despite her own modest means. "Brought you some fresh bread and soup," she said, setting the basket on the kitchen table. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." Samuel managed a grateful smile. "You don't have to keep feeding me, Margaret. You've got your own concerns." "Nonsense. What are neighbors for?" She studied his face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd raised 5 children. "What's troubling you? And don't say it's nothing. I can see it written all over your face." Samuel told her about the morning's visitors and their proposition. Margaret's expression grew darker with each word, and by the time he finished, she was shaking her head vigorously. "Samuel Crawford, you can't be seriously considering this madness. What you're describing sounds like slavery with extra steps." "It's not slavery," Samuel protested weakly. "They're volunteers, people who need help getting out of debt." "Volunteers?" Margaret's voice rose. "People don't volunteer to become indentured servants unless they're desperate beyond measure. You'd be taking advantage of someone's misfortune." Samuel slumped into a kitchen chair, suddenly feeling older than his 42 years. "I don't know what else to do, Margaret. I'm going to lose everything my father built. Maybe if I can get some help, get the ranch running again, I can pay whoever helps me a fair wage once I'm back on my feet." Margaret sat across from him, her weathered hands folding over his. "Listen to me, Samuel. There are other ways. You could sell part of the land, maybe find a job in town while you figure things out. This auction business, it's not right, and you know it." They talked until late afternoon, Margaret offering alternatives, while Samuel struggled with his conscience. Part of him knew she was right, that participating in such an arrangement would compromise everything he claimed to believe in. But the larger part, the part driven by desperation and fear, kept returning to the image of his ranch restored to its former glory. As evening approached, Margaret finally left, but not before extracting a promise that Samuel would think carefully before making any decisions. He spent the night packing the house, wrestling with choices that seemed to offer no good solutions. By dawn, exhaustion had worn down his resistance to the idea that maybe, just maybe, he could make this work in everyone's favor. The auction was scheduled for noon in the basement of the old courthouse. Samuel arrived early, telling himself he was just looking, just trying to understand what he was considering. The basement had been converted into a makeshift auction hall, with folding chairs arranged in rows facing a small platform. About 30 people filled the seats, most of them well-dressed individuals who looked nothing like struggling ranchers. Samuel took a seat in the back, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as he observed his fellow bidders. They spoke in hushed tones about previous auctions and the quality of the merchandise, their casual discussions of human lives making his stomach turn. He was about to leave when the auctioneer, a thin man with nervous hands, called for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending today's proceedings. We have 7 individuals offering their services today, each with different skills and terms of indenture. Let's begin with our first presenter." A young man, perhaps 25, was brought to the platform. He stood straight despite the obvious fear in his eyes as the auctioneer read his details. College graduate, medical school debt of $200,000, offering 5 years of labor. The bidding started at $5,000 and quickly escalated. Samuel watched in growing horror as person after person was presented like livestock at a county fair. Each had a story of financial ruin, medical bills, or family obligations that had driven them to this desperate measure. The bidders showed no emotion as they calculated the value of human desperation, raising their numbered cards with the same detachment they might show when buying farm equipment. When the 5th person took the platform, Samuel's breath caught in his throat. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with auburn hair that caught the harsh fluorescent light. Despite the degrading circumstances, she held herself with a dignity that seemed unbreakable. Her green eyes swept the crowd with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "This is Clara Hartwell," the auctioneer announced. "Age 24, college graduate with a degree in agricultural science. She's offering 3 years of labor to settle family medical debts totaling $58,000. Miss Hartwell has experience in crop management, animal husbandry, and ranch operations." Samuel found himself leaning forward, captivated not just by Clara's qualifications, but by something in her bearing that spoke of strength beneath the vulnerability. She wasn't broken by her circumstances. She was adapting to them with the kind of resilience he'd seen in the strongest ranch hands. The bidding began at $2,000. Samuel's hand moved almost without conscious thought, raising his numbered card. Other bids followed quickly, the price climbing as men in expensive suits saw value in Clara's education and experience. But Samuel found himself continuing to bid, driven by something more than practical need. At $8,000, most of the competition dropped out. Only Samuel and a heavyset man in a tailored suit remained. The man had the look of someone who owned multiple businesses, someone who could absorb the cost without feeling it. Samuel knew he was outmatched financially, but something in Clara's eyes when she looked his direction made him continue. 9,000, the suited man called out. Samuel's heart pounded as he calculated his resources. He had maybe $3,000 he could access immediately, but Blackwood had mentioned payment plans. Before he could lose his nerve, he raised his card again. 10,000. The suited man turned to look at Samuel with surprise and annoyance. He studied the weathered rancher for a moment, taking in the worn clothes and sun-beaten face, then raised his own card. 12,000. Samuel closed his eyes, knowing he'd reached his limit. But when he opened them again, Clara was looking directly at him. In her gaze, he saw something that looked almost like hope, as if she recognized in him someone who might treat her with basic human decency. 15,000, Samuel heard himself say, the words coming from some desperate place deep inside. The suited man hesitated, clearly questioning whether Clara was worth that much to him. After a long moment, he shook his head and lowered his card. The auctioneer's gavel fell with a sound like thunder. Sold to bidder number 47 for $15,000. Samuel sat in stunned silence as the paperwork was prepared. What had he done? He just committed to spending money he didn't have on an arrangement that violated every principle he'd been raised with. Yet when Clara was brought over to meet him, and he saw the relief in her eyes, he felt something that had been absent from his life for months. Hope. Mr. Crawford, Clara's voice was steady despite her circumstances. I want you to know that I'll work hard for you. I understand agricultural operations, and I believe I can help make your ranch profitable again. Samuel looked into her green eyes and saw intelligence, determination, and a strength that reminded him of his own mother. We'll figure this out together, he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. I promise you'll be treated with respect and dignity. As they left the courthouse together, both of them uncertain about what they'd gotten themselves into, neither could have imagined that this desperate arrangement would become the foundation of something neither slavery nor charity, but partnership built on mutual respect and shared determination to survive. The drive to the ranch passed in heavy silence, both Samuel and Clara lost in their own thoughts as the countryside rolled past the windows of Samuel's battered truck. Clara sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her few belongings contained in a single duffel bag that rested on her lap like a shield. Samuel gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles white as he contemplated the magnitude of what he'd just done. The weight of the legal documents in his shirt pocket felt heavier than their actual substance. Clara Hartwell was now, according to the law, bound to work for him for 3 years in exchange for room, board, and the gradual payment of her family's medical debts. The arrangement was supposed to benefit both parties, but sitting beside this young woman whose life he'd effectively purchased, Samuel felt like he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. Tell me about your family, Samuel said finally, desperate to break the awkward silence and perhaps understand what had driven Clara to such an extreme measure. Clara's hands tightened on her bag, but she answered in a steady voice. My parents owned a small dairy farm in Wisconsin. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years ago. The treatments were expensive, and insurance only covered a fraction of the costs. When he died last spring, my mother and I were left with bills we couldn't pay. Samuel felt his chest tighten with sympathy. He'd watched his own father waste away from illness, though they'd been fortunate enough to have decent insurance. I'm sorry for your loss. My mother had a heart attack 3 months after my father's funeral, Clara continued, her voice growing quieter. The stress, the grief, the financial pressure, it all became too much for her. She survived, but the medical bills from both of them. She trailed off, staring out at the passing landscape. Why didn't you declare bankruptcy? Samuel asked gently. Clara's laugh was bitter. We tried, but my parents had co-signed for my college loans and some of the medical debt was secured against the farm. Bankruptcy wouldn't have cleared everything, and we would have lost the land anyway. This way, at least my mother gets to keep the farm. She's living with my aunt now, and the monthly payments from my indenture will keep the creditors satisfied. Samuel absorbed this information as they turned onto the dirt road leading to his property. Clara was sacrificing 3 years of her freedom to save her family's legacy, a decision he understood all too well. It was exactly the kind of choice he might have made in her position, which made his role in the arrangement even more uncomfortable. The ranch looked even more desolate than usual as they pulled up to the house. Clara studied the rundown buildings and barren fields with the analytical eye of someone trained in agricultural science. Samuel watched her face, trying to gauge her reaction to what would be her home and workplace for the next 3 years. "How many cattle do you currently have?" Clara asked as they climbed out of the truck. "3, had a herd of about 60 before the drought hit." Clara nodded, walking toward the fence that contained his remaining animals. "They look malnourished. When did you last have feed delivered?" Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks. "About 6 weeks ago, I've been rationing what I have left." Clara examined the cattle with professional interest, then turned to survey the empty fields. "What crops were you growing before?" "Corn, soybeans, some hay. The wells went dry 2 seasons ago, and I couldn't afford to drill deeper or install irrigation systems." "Have you tested the soil recently? Sometimes, after drought conditions, the mineral content changes, and you might be able to grow drought-resistant crops with the right amendments." Samuel stared at her in surprise. He'd expected anger, resentment, or at least sullen compliance from someone forced into her position. Instead, Clara was already analyzing his problems with the keen mind of someone genuinely interested in finding solutions. They spent the rest of the afternoon touring the property. Clara asked detailed questions about everything from water sources to soil composition to the structural integrity of the buildings. Samuel found himself opening up more than he had to anyone in months, sharing his struggles and failures with someone who seemed to understand both the technical and emotional challenges of farming. As evening approached, they stood in the farmhouse kitchen, both suddenly aware of the awkwardness of their living arrangement. Samuel realized he hadn't even considered the practical aspects of housing Clara. His 2-bedroom house had seemed spacious when he lived alone, but now it felt impossibly small. "I can sleep in the barn," Clara offered, noticing his discomfort. "Absolutely not," Samuel replied firmly. "You'll take the spare bedroom. It's not much, but it's clean and warm." Clara looked around the modest kitchen with its worn appliances and faded linoleum. "I can cook if you'd like, and I'll handle my own laundry." Samuel felt another wave of discomfort at how quickly she'd shifted into the role of domestic help. "Clara, I want to establish some ground rules. You're not a servant here. Yes, legally we have this arrangement, but I'm hoping we can work together as partners. You have knowledge and skills that I need, and I have land and resources that you can use to solve problems." Clara studied his face carefully, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we try to save this ranch together. You work with me to figure out how to make it profitable again, and I'll make sure you're treated with respect and given a voice in the decisions. When your 3 years are up, if we've succeeded in turning things around, maybe we can discuss a more traditional employment arrangement." "And if we fail?" Samuel smiled grimly. "Then at least we'll fail together, and your family's debt will still be paid." They prepared dinner together that night, a simple meal of canned soup and bread that Margaret had brought. As they ate, Clara began to open up about her background in agricultural science, her experiences working on various farms during college, and her ideas for sustainable farming practices. Samuel found himself genuinely engaged in their conversation, his mind stimulated in a way it hadn't been for months. "I've been thinking about your water situation," Clara said as they cleaned up the dishes. "There might be ways to capture and store rainwater more efficiently, and depending on your soil composition, you might be able to grow crops that actually help restore the land's ability to retain moisture." Samuel felt a spark of hope that he'd almost forgotten was possible. "You really think this place can be saved?" "I think any land can be restored with the right approach and enough determination," Clara replied. "The question is whether you're willing to try some unconventional methods." Over the following weeks, Clara threw herself into analyzing every aspect of the ranch's operations with an intensity that both impressed and worried Samuel. She was up before dawn studying soil samples, spent her days walking the fields and examining the irrigation infrastructure, and stayed up late into the night researching sustainable farming techniques on Samuel's ancient computer. Samuel found himself learning more about his own land than he'd ever known. Clara explained how years of conventional farming practices had depleted the soil's natural fertility, how the drought had been exacerbated by poor water management, and how a shift toward regenerative agriculture could gradually restore the land's health. The key, Clara explained one evening as they sat on the porch reviewing her notes, is working with natural systems instead of against them. Your father's generation did what they thought was right based on what they knew then. But we understand now that biodiversity and soil health are connected to everything else: water retention, crop yields, even resistance to extreme weather. Samuel watched Clara's face light up as she talked about cover crops and rotational grazing, about mycorrhizal networks and carbon sequestration. Her passion for the work was infectious, and he found himself genuinely excited about farming for the first time in years. But it was during their 4th week together that their relationship shifted from professional to personal. Clara had been working long hours without complaint, but Samuel noticed she'd been eating less and sleeping poorly. One evening, he found her sitting on the front steps, staring out at the empty fields with tears streaming down her face. "Clara," Samuel sat down beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "What's wrong?" "I talked to my mother today," Clara said quietly. "She's doing well, but she sounds so lonely. She keeps asking when I'll be able to visit, and I can't tell her that I don't know if I'll be able to leave here for 3 years. Samuel felt his heart clench. In his desperation to save his ranch, he'd lost sight of what Clara was sacrificing. She wasn't just providing labor. She was giving up her freedom, her connections to family, her ability to live her own life. "Clara, I never intended for you to be a prisoner here. If you need to visit your mother, we'll figure out a way to make it happen." Clara looked at him with surprise. "But the contract..." "The contract says you work for me for 3 years. It doesn't say you can't have a life outside of work." Samuel made a decision that felt both risky and right. "Tomorrow, we're going to establish some new rules. You'll have weekends off, time for personal pursuits, and we'll arrange for regular visits to see your mother." "Samuel, you don't have to do this. I knew what I was agreeing to." "Maybe you did, but I'm learning what I agreed to, and I don't like it." Samuel stood up, his jaw set with determination. "We're going to find a way to make this work that doesn't require you to sacrifice everything that makes life worth living." That night, Samuel lay awake thinking about the young woman sleeping in the room down the hall. Clara had entered his life as a solution to a financial problem, but she was becoming something more: a partner, a friend, and perhaps the key to saving not just his ranch, but himself. The next morning brought their first real test as partners. Samuel woke to find Clara already up, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a serious expression. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," she said, "and I have a proposition for you." Samuel poured his own coffee and waited. "Instead of thinking about this as an employer-employee relationship, what if we approached it as a business partnership? I bring knowledge, labor, and new ideas. You bring land, equipment, and experience. We work together to build something profitable, and when my debt is paid off, we evaluate whether to continue as equal partners." Samuel felt his pulse quicken. "What are you suggesting exactly?" "I'm suggesting that instead of treating me like an indentured servant, you treat me like an investor who's contributing labor instead of capital. Give me a voice in decision-making, a share in any profits we generate, and the respect of a true partner." Samuel studied Clara's face, seeing the intelligence and strength that had first caught his attention at the auction. "And if I agree to this?" Clara's smile was the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her since they'd met. "Then I think we have a real chance of turning this place into something special." As they shook hands on their new arrangement, both of them felt the weight of possibility. What had begun as a desperate transaction was evolving into something neither had expected: a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared determination to create a better future from the ruins of their separate pasts. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the first green shoots of grass after a long winter. Clara's presence on the ranch had shifted from that of hired help to genuine collaborator, and the changes were evident in every aspect of their daily routine. Where Samuel had once struggled alone with problems that seemed insurmountable, He now had someone whose fresh perspective and scientific training brought new solutions to old challenges. Their first major project together was addressing the ranch's water crisis. Clara had spent countless hours researching the property's hydrology, studying county records and geological surveys that Samuel had never known existed. She discovered that while the surface wells had indeed failed during the drought, there were likely deeper aquifers that could be accessed with proper drilling. The key is understanding the water table's seasonal fluctuations, Clara explained one morning as they stood in what had once been Samuel's most productive field. She held a soil auger, having just completed another test of the subsurface conditions. Your father drilled his wells based on the water levels from the 1970s, but climate patterns have shifted. We need to go deeper and place them strategically to maximize capture. Samuel watched as Clara marked potential drilling sites with bright orange flags, her movements confident and purposeful. The transformation in her demeanor over the past month had been remarkable. The frightened young woman from the auction had given way to a professional who attacked problems with scientific rigor and unwavering determination. "This is going to cost money we don't have," Samuel pointed out, though his tone lacked the despair that had characterized such observations in the past. Clara straightened, pushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "I've been thinking about that. There are grants available for agricultural water conservation projects, and if we can demonstrate that we're implementing sustainable practices, we might qualify for low-interest loans through the Department of Agriculture." Samuel felt that familiar spark of hope that had become more frequent since Clara's arrival. "You really think we could get funding?" "I think we can if we present a comprehensive plan that shows how water conservation fits into a larger sustainability strategy." Clara pulled a thick folder from her backpack, filled with research and calculations she'd been working on. "But it means committing to some significant changes in how we operate." They spent the rest of the morning going through Clara's proposals, and Samuel found himself both excited and overwhelmed by the scope of her vision. She wasn't just thinking about fixing immediate problems. She was planning a complete transformation of the ranch's approach to agriculture. Clara proposed converting large portions of the property to rotational grazing systems that would rebuild soil health while supporting livestock. She outlined plans for diverse crop rotations that would improve the land's fertility naturally, reducing dependence on expensive fertilizers. Most ambitiously, she suggested developing agrotourism opportunities that could provide additional income streams while educating the public about sustainable farming practices. "This is incredible work, Clara," Samuel said as he reviewed her detailed projections. "But I have to ask, why are you putting this much effort into planning the future of a ranch that isn't really yours?" Clara's hands stilled on the papers she'd been organizing. It was a question that had been lurking beneath their developing partnership, the elephant in the room that neither had directly addressed. "Because," Clara said slowly, "for the first time since my father died, I feel like I'm working towards something meaningful instead of just running from disaster. And because—" She paused, looking out over the fields that were already showing signs of recovery under her care. "Because I think this could be mine in a way that matters more than legal ownership." Samuel felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that their arrangement had evolved far beyond what either had originally envisioned. "Clara, I want you to know that everything you're contributing here, it's not going unnoticed. When your 3 years are up, I want you to have real choices about your future." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a white pickup truck kicking up dust as it approached the house. Samuel recognized the vehicle immediately and felt his stomach drop. Richard Blackwood emerged from the driver's side, his expensive suit looking even more out of place against the rural backdrop than it had during his first visit. "Mr. Crawford," Blackwood called out as he approached, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I thought I'd stop by to see how you're getting along with your new employee." Samuel positioned himself slightly in front of Clara, a protective instinct he hadn't realized he possessed. "Everything's fine, Mr. Blackwood. Clara's proving to be an excellent addition to the operation." Blackwood's gaze moved to Clara, studying her with an intensity that made Samuel's skin crawl. "Miss Hartwell, isn't it? I hope you're finding the work satisfactory." Clara met his stare with calm confidence. "I am, thank you." "Excellent. I actually wanted to discuss the financial aspects of your arrangement with Mr. Crawford." Blackwood turned his attention back to Samuel. "I understand you've been somewhat delayed in making your first payment." Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks. The truth was that his finances were even more precarious than they'd been when he'd first bid on Clara's indenture. The small amount of cash he'd had was quickly depleted by basic necessities, and the bank was growing increasingly impatient about his overdue mortgage payments. "I'm working on it," Samuel said carefully. "We're applying for grants and loans that should resolve the situation." Blackwood's smile turned predatory. "I'm sure you are. However, given the delay, my clients are concerned about the security of their investment. We've had other interested parties inquire about Miss Hartwell's contract." "Other interested parties?" Clara's voice was sharp with alarm. "Oh yes, several businessmen who feel they could make better use of your skills. In fact, one gentleman has offered to pay Mr. Crawford's debt to us and assume responsibility for the remainder of your indenture period." Samuel felt rage building in his chest. "Clara's contract isn't for sale." "Actually, Mr. Crawford, if you review the documentation, you'll find that the contract can be transferred under certain circumstances, non-payment being one of them." Blackwood pulled out a business card and handed it to Samuel. "I'll be in touch soon about resolving this matter one way or another." After Blackwood left, Samuel and Clara stood in heavy silence. The threat hung between them like a storm cloud, casting shadows over all the progress they'd made and the plans they'd developed. "Samuel," Clara said quietly, "how much do you owe them?" "15,000 for your contract, plus interest and fees. It's up to about 18,000 now." Clara closed her eyes, and Samuel could see her calculating, trying to find solutions where none seemed to exist. What happens if you can't pay? Samuel couldn't bring himself to voice the possibility that Clara could be transferred to someone else, someone who might not share his commitment to treating her with dignity and respect. The thought of losing her, not just as a partner, but as a person who had become important to him, was more painful than he'd expected. "We'll figure something out," Samuel said with more confidence than he felt. That evening, Clara surprised Samuel by announcing she was going into town. She'd borrowed his truck and returned several hours later with a grim expression and a stack of papers. "I've been making some calls and doing research," she said as she spread documents across the kitchen table. "I think I found a way to solve our problem, but you're not going to like it." Samuel examined the papers, recognizing loan applications and business proposals. "What is this?" "It's a plan to incorporate the ranch as a limited liability company with both of us as partners. If we can get approved for a small business loan based on our sustainability plan, we could pay off Blackwood and restructure our entire arrangement." Samuel looked up from the documents. "Clara, this would make you a legal partner in the ranch, not an indentured employee. Are you sure this is what you want?" "I've been thinking about what Blackwood said, about other people wanting to buy my contract. The truth is, Samuel, I'd rather take the risk of business partnership with you than face the uncertainty of being transferred to someone else. At least with you, I know I'll be treated as a human being." Samuel felt a surge of emotion that surprised him with its intensity. Over the weeks they'd worked together, Clara had become more than just a solution to his labor problems. She'd become a friend, a collaborator, and someone whose well-being mattered to him in ways that had nothing to do with their legal arrangement. "There's something else," Clara continued. "I called my mother and told her about our situation. She's worried, of course, but she supports whatever decision I make. She also mentioned something interesting. My father had a life insurance policy that my mother forgot about in all the chaos after he died. It's not a huge amount, maybe $10,000, but if she could access it." "Clara, no. I won't let you ask your mother to sacrifice her financial security for this. She wants to help Samuel. And the truth is, if we can make this ranch profitable, the partnership would benefit both our families in the long run." They spent the next several days refining their business plan and preparing loan applications. Clara's scientific approach to agriculture, combined with Samuel's practical experience and deep knowledge of the land, created a compelling case for investment. They proposed a model that would demonstrate how sustainable practices could restore damaged farmland while creating economic opportunities in rural communities. The process forced them to articulate their vision for the ranch's future in ways they'd never done before. They talked about expanding beyond traditional crops to include herbs and specialty vegetables for local restaurants. They discussed hosting educational workshops for other farmers interested in sustainable practices. They even planned for the possibility of agrotourism, with visitors coming to learn about regenerative agriculture while enjoying the rural setting. Margaret Wilson proved to be an unexpected ally in their efforts. When she learned about Blackwood's threats, she offered to co-sign their loan application, putting her own property at risk to support their venture. "You two have something special here," she told them as they sat in her kitchen, reviewing their final proposal. "I've watched Samuel these past weeks, and I haven't seen him this alive since before his parents died. And Clara, honey, you found your calling. It would be a crime to let some city businessman destroy what you're building." The loan application was submitted on a Wednesday, and by Friday they had a preliminary approval. The bank was impressed by their comprehensive plan and Clara's credentials, and they were willing to provide enough funding to pay off Blackwood's organization and provide working capital for the ranch's restoration. When Samuel called Blackwood to inform him that payment would be made in full within the week, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "That's unexpected, Mr. Crawford. My clients will be disappointed to lose such a promising investment." "I'm sure they'll find other opportunities," Samuel replied, unable to keep the satisfaction out of his voice. The day they signed the final paperwork to establish Crawford Hartwell Agricultural Partners, LLC, was the day their relationship truly changed. Standing in the bank's conference room, watching Clara sign documents that made her an equal partner in the ranch's future, Samuel realized that what had begun as a desperate attempt to save his family's legacy had become something entirely different, the foundation of a new kind of family, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. As they drove home from the bank, both of them giddy with relief and excitement, Clara turned to Samuel with a smile that lit up her entire face. "So, partner," she said, "ready to change the world one farm at a time?" Samuel laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Let's start with changing this ranch and see how far that takes us." Looking out over the land that was now truly theirs to shape and restore, both of them felt the weight of possibility. The desperate arrangement that had brought them together had evolved into something neither had expected, but both had needed a partnership that promised to heal not just the land they worked, but the wounds that had driven them to each other in the first place. The spring rains came late that year, but when they finally arrived, they transformed the ranch in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Fields that had lain barren for 3 years suddenly sprouted with the cover crops Clara had planted, creating a patchwork of green across the landscape. The new wells they'd drilled were producing clean, abundant water, and their innovative irrigation system was distributing it efficiently across the property. Standing on the porch on a warm May morning, Samuel watched Clara move through the fields with the easy confidence of someone who had found her true calling. She was checking the young corn shoots that represented their first major crop planting since the partnership began. Her auburn hair caught the early sunlight, and there was a joy in her movements that spoke of someone who had found not just work, but purpose. 6 months had passed since they'd become official partners, and the transformation went far beyond the physical improvements to the ranch. Samuel had discovered that working alongside Clara brought out aspects of himself he'd forgotten existed: creativity, optimism, and a willingness to take risks that extended beyond mere survival. Their partnership had evolved into something that neither had anticipated. Long working days naturally led to shared meals and evening conversations that ranged from crop rotation strategies to dreams for the future. Samuel found himself looking forward to these quiet moments together, when the demands of the ranch gave way to more personal exchanges. "The corn looks promising," Clara said as she joined him on the porch, wiping her hands on a towel. "If the weather holds, we should have a decent yield by late summer." Samuel handed her a cup of coffee, enjoying the simple domesticity of the gesture. "Margaret stopped by yesterday while you were in town. She said the county agent has been asking questions about our operation." Clara's expression grew concerned. "What kind of questions?" "Good questions, apparently. Word is getting around about what we're doing here, and other farmers are interested in learning about our methods." Samuel smiled at Clara's surprised reaction. "Margaret thinks we might want to consider hosting that workshop you mentioned in your business plan." The idea of sharing their knowledge with other struggling farmers had been part of Clara's original vision, but both had assumed it would be years before they were established enough to take on such a role. Yet their success had been more rapid than either had dared hope. "Do you think we're ready for something like that?" Clara asked, settling into the chair beside him. Samuel studied her profile as she gazed out over their thriving fields. Somewhere in the past months, his feelings for Clara had shifted from professional admiration to something deeper and more personal. He'd caught himself watching her work with an appreciation that went beyond her agricultural expertise, noticing the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, or how her eyes lit up when discussing a new idea. "I think we're as ready as we'll ever be," Samuel said. "Besides, isn't part of sustainable agriculture sharing knowledge so everyone benefits?" Clara turned to look at him, and Samuel felt that familiar flutter in his chest that occurred whenever their eyes met. There had been moments recently when he'd sensed a similar awareness from Clara, fleeting glances that lasted a heartbeat too long, or the way her hand would linger when she passed him tools in the field. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle, but this time it wasn't the sleek sedan that had brought unwelcome visitors in the past. Instead, a dusty pickup truck pulled into their driveway, and a woman in her 50s climbed out with a warm smile and an armload of covered dishes. "That must be my mother," Clara said, her voice suddenly tight with emotion. Samuel watched as Clara ran to embrace the older woman, seeing immediately where Clara had inherited her strength and grace. Ellen Hartwell was smaller than her daughter, but carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had first caught Samuel's attention at the auction. "Mom, this is Samuel," Clara said as they approached the porch. "Samuel, my mother, Ellen Hartwell." Ellen studied Samuel with the sharp eyes of a mother evaluating the man in her daughter's life. Samuel felt the weight of her scrutiny and understood that this meeting would determine much about his relationship with Clara going forward. "Mr. Crawford," Ellen said formally, extending her hand, "I've heard a great deal about you and your partnership with my daughter. Please call me Samuel, and I hope Clara's told you good things." Ellen's expression softened slightly. "She's told me that you've treated her with respect and given her opportunities to use her education. For a mother who was terrified about her daughter's situation, that means everything." They spent the afternoon giving Ellen a tour of the ranch, and Samuel found himself seeing their accomplishments through her eyes. The thriving fields, the healthy cattle they'd gradually added to their herd, the efficiently organized barns and equipment, all of it spoke to the success of their partnership. But more importantly, he saw how Clara bloomed under her mother's attention, sharing her achievements with the pride of someone who had found her calling. "This is remarkable, Clara," Ellen said as they stood in the greenhouse Clara had designed for starting seedlings and extending their growing season. "Your father would be so proud of what you've accomplished." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and Samuel felt his heart clench as he watched her struggle with emotions she rarely allowed herself to show. "I just wish he could see this, Mom. I wish he could know that his sacrifice meant something." Ellen took her daughter's hands in her own. "Honey, your father's sacrifice already meant something. It gave you the education and knowledge that made all of this possible. And from what I can see, you've found more than just a way to pay off debt. You've found a home and a future." That evening, as Ellen prepared to return to Wisconsin, she pulled Samuel aside for a private conversation. They stood beside her truck in the gathering dusk, and Samuel braced himself for the protective mother's interrogation he'd been expecting all day. "Samuel, I want you to know that Clara is the most important thing in my life," Ellen began. "When she made the decision to enter that indenture arrangement, I was terrified about what might happen to her. I'd heard stories." Samuel felt shame wash over him as he remembered his own desperate state of mind when he'd first encountered those same stories. "I understand your concerns, Mrs. Hartwell. I can't imagine how difficult this has been for you. What I want you to understand," Ellen continued, "is that my daughter is strong, but she's also been through more pain and loss than anyone her age should have to endure. She's learned to be independent because she's had to be, but that doesn't mean she doesn't need people who care about her." Samuel met Ellen's steady gaze. "I do care about her, Mrs. Hartwell, more than I probably have any right to." Ellen smiled for the first time during their conversation. "That's what I was hoping to hear. Clara may not realize it yet, but the way she talks about you, about this place, and the work you're doing together, it's not just professional admiration. She's found something here that goes beyond business partnership." After Ellen left, Samuel and Clara found themselves alone together for the first time in days. The visit had stirred up emotions in both of them, bringing to the surface feelings that had been developing gradually over their months together. "Your mother is wonderful," Samuel said as they cleaned up the dinner dishes together. "I can see where you get your strength." Clara smiled, but Samuel could see the sadness lingering in her eyes. "She's been through so much, and she still finds ways to worry about me. I sometimes wonder if I made the right choice, leaving her alone to deal with everything." Samuel turned to face Clara fully, setting down the plate he'd been drying. "Clara, what you did for your family took incredible courage, and what you've built here, what we've built together, it's extraordinary." Clara looked up at him, and Samuel felt the charged atmosphere that had been building between them for weeks finally reach a breaking point. They stood close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could smell the subtle scent of the herbal soap she favored. "Samuel," Clara said softly, "I need to tell you something. The way I feel about you, about this place, it's not what I expected when I signed that contract." Samuel reached out to gently touch Clara's cheek, his heart racing as she leaned into his palm. "It's not what I expected either. Clara, you've changed everything for me. This ranch, my whole life, none of it means anything if you're not part of it." When they kissed, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, the culmination of months of growing trust, respect, and affection. All the barriers that their unusual beginning had created seemed to dissolve in that moment, leaving only two people who had found in each other something they'd never known they were looking for. They spent the evening talking about their feelings, about the strange circumstances that had brought them together, and about the future they wanted to build. Samuel told Clara about the loneliness that had consumed him before her arrival, about how her presence had restored his faith in the possibility of happiness. Clara shared her fears about being vulnerable after so much loss, and her amazement at finding both professional fulfillment and personal connection in the same place. Their newfound intimacy brought a new dimension to their partnership, but it also highlighted the challenges they still faced. While their ranch was thriving, they were far from financially secure. The loan payments were manageable but substantial, and any setback could still threaten everything they'd built. Those setbacks came sooner than either had anticipated. A late frost in June damaged a significant portion of their corn crop, reducing their expected income by thousands of dollars. Then equipment failures forced expensive repairs that strained their cash flow. Most seriously, a severe storm in July damaged several buildings and destroyed their newly constructed greenhouse. Standing in the wreckage of the greenhouse they'd worked so hard to build, Clara fought back tears of frustration and exhaustion. "Maybe we're fooling ourselves, Samuel. Maybe this was all just a fantasy." Samuel pulled her into his arms, feeling her tremble with the effort of holding back her emotions. "Clara, we've overcome worse than this. We'll rebuild, we'll adapt, and we'll keep moving forward." "What if we can't? What if we lose everything and I end up right back where I started, except now I'll have dragged you down with me?" Samuel held her tighter, understanding that her fears went deeper than their current crisis. "Clara, listen to me. Whatever happens, we face it together. You're not alone anymore, and neither am I. We're partners in every sense of the word." As they stood together among the debris of their damaged dreams, both of them realized that their relationship had been tested by more than just romantic feelings. They'd been tested by adversity, by the constant pressure of financial uncertainty, and by the challenge of building something meaningful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The test had revealed something important. Their partnership wasn't built on convenience or desperation anymore. It was built on love, respect, and a shared vision of the future that was stronger than any individual setback. The recovery from the storm damage became an opportunity to demonstrate the strength of their relationship and the support they'd built in the community. Margaret organized a barn raising that brought dozens of neighbors to help rebuild their damaged structures. Local businesses donated materials and equipment. The county extension office provided resources for replanting their damaged crops with varieties that could still mature before the first frost. Most importantly, Clara's mother returned to help with the recovery effort, this time bringing several of Clara's aunts and cousins who stayed for 2 weeks to assist with the rebuilding. Samuel found himself welcomed into the extended Heartfelt family with a warmth that spoke to the genuine affection Clara's relatives felt for their relationship. "You know," Ellen told Samuel one evening as they watched Clara directing the installation of their new, improved greenhouse, "I worried for so long about Clara's sacrifice, about what she was giving up. But watching her now, I realized she didn't sacrifice anything. She found exactly what she was meant to find." Samuel smiled, his heart full as he watched the woman he loved work with passionate dedication on rebuilding their shared dream. "We both did, Mrs. Hartwell, we both did." 2 years after the storm that had nearly broken their spirits, Samuel and Clara stood in the same spot where their greenhouse had once been destroyed. But now they were surrounded by not one but three flourishing structures that served as the heart of their expanded agricultural operation. The Crawford Hartwell Ranch had become more than just a successful farm. It had become a model for sustainable agriculture that attracted visitors from across the region. The transformation was remarkable. Where once barren fields had stretched to the horizon, now a diverse landscape of crops, pastures, and carefully managed natural areas created a patchwork of productivity and beauty. Their cattle grazed in rotational paddocks that improved soil health with each season. Their organic vegetable production supplied 3 local restaurants and a farmer's market, and their educational workshops had become so popular they had to limit attendance. "Remember when we thought the storm damage might be the end of everything?" Clara asked, as they watched a group of visiting farmers examine their water conservation systems. Samuel slipped his arm around his wife's waist, still feeling a thrill at the simple reality of being able to claim her as his partner in every aspect of life. They'd married the previous spring in a ceremony held right here on the ranch, surrounded by family, friends, and neighbors who had supported their journey from desperate strangers to successful partners to loving spouses. "I remember you crying in the wreckage of that greenhouse," Samuel replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I also remember thinking that if we could survive that, we could survive anything." Clara leaned into his embrace, her hand moving instinctively to rest on the gentle curve of her belly where their first child was growing. They discovered the pregnancy just last month, another unexpected blessing in a life that had been full of surprises since that day at the courthouse auction. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that what had begun as one of the darkest chapters of their lives had led to their greatest happiness. Samuel often reflected on the desperate man he'd been when he first raised his hand to bid on Clara's indenture contract. He'd been trying to save a failing ranch and had ended up finding a partner who'd helped him build something far greater than what his father had left him. "Samuel, Clara," Margaret's voice called from the direction of the main house. At 72, their neighbor remained energetic and had become an unofficial grandmother to them both. "Your workshop guests are ready for the soil management demonstration." As they made their way toward the group of farmers, Samuel marveled at how natural Clara looked in the role of educator. She discovered a gift for teaching that complemented her scientific knowledge, making complex agricultural concepts accessible to farmers with varying levels of formal education. The workshop participants represented the kind of community they'd hoped to build when they first dreamed of sharing their knowledge. There was Janet Morrison, a young woman trying to convert her family's conventional farm to organic methods. Bob and Linda Chen had driven 6 hours from Iowa to learn about crop rotation techniques. Maria Santos was exploring sustainable practices that could work on her family's small acreage in Texas. "The key to soil restoration," Clara was explaining as she led the group through their demonstration plots, "is understanding that soil isn't just dirt, it's a living ecosystem. Every practice we implement either feeds that ecosystem or depletes it." Samuel watched the visitors hang on Clara's every word, seeing in their faces the same hunger for knowledge and hope that had driven Clara herself during her darkest days. She was sharing more than just agricultural techniques. She was offering proof that desperate situations could be transformed into something beautiful with the right approach and enough determination. "Mr. Crawford," Janet Morrison approached him as Clara continued her explanation. "I have to ask, how did you know that Clara would be such an asset to your operation? I mean, taking on an indentured worker seems like such a risk." Samuel felt the familiar discomfort that arose whenever someone referenced the origins of his relationship with Clara. Even though their story had become well known in agricultural circles, he'd never grown comfortable with the reminder of how their partnership had begun. "Honestly," Samuel said carefully, "I didn't know. I was desperate enough to try anything, and Clara was brave enough to trust that we could build something better than the situation that brought us together." The truth was more complex than he could easily explain to strangers. Yes, he'd initially seen Clara as a solution to his labor problems, but even in that first moment at the auction, something about her bearing had suggested she was meant for more than mere servitude. His decision to restructure their relationship into a true partnership had been driven as much by instinct as by conscience. That evening, after their guests had departed and the ranch had settled into its familiar, quiet rhythm, Samuel and Clara sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint their fields in shades of gold and amber. These peaceful moments had become precious to them, opportunities to reconnect after busy days and dream about the future they were building together. "I got a call from the university today," Clara said, leaning against Samuel's shoulder. "They want me to consider developing a curriculum for their sustainable agriculture program." Samuel felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Over the past year, Clara had received several offers from academic institutions and consulting firms, recognitions of her growing reputation as an expert in regenerative farming practices. Each opportunity represented the kind of professional advancement she deserved, but also the possibility that her ambitions might take her away from the ranch. "What did you tell them?" Samuel asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I told them I'd discuss it with my husband and business partner." Clara turned to meet his eyes. "Samuel, I need you to know that nothing, no job, no opportunity is more important to me than what we've built here together. This ranch, our marriage, our family, this is my choice, and it's the choice I'll make every time." Samuel felt relief wash over him, followed immediately by guilt for doubting her commitment. "Clara, I don't want to be the reason you miss out on opportunities. You're brilliant, and the world needs your expertise." "The world is already getting my expertise," Clara replied firmly. "Through our workshops, through the farmers we train, through the example we're setting, and now through the curriculum I'm going to develop from here as a consultant while continuing to run our ranch." Samuel kissed her forehead, marveling again at her ability to find solutions that honored all her priorities. "You've thought this through." "I've learned from the best," Clara said with a smile. "My husband taught me that the best solutions come from refusing to accept that you have to choose between things that matter." As if summoned by their conversation about the future, Ellen Hartwell's truck appeared on the horizon, creating the familiar cloud of dust that announced her regular visits. She'd become a fixture at the ranch since retiring and selling her Wisconsin farm, splitting her time between Clara's aunt in Milwaukee and extended stays with her daughter and son-in-law. "I swear that woman has radar for family moments," Clara laughed, but her voice was full of affection. Ellen's presence in their lives had been one of the unexpected gifts of their marriage, providing grandmotherly wisdom and the kind of family support both Samuel and Clara had missed since losing their parents. Ellen emerged from her truck carrying what appeared to be several small packages and wearing the kind of mysterious smile that suggested she was up to something. "Perfect timing," Ellen called out as she approached the porch. "I have something for both of you." The packages turned out to be photo albums, carefully assembled collections of pictures documenting their journey from that first desperate spring through their wedding and beyond. Ellen had been quietly gathering photos from everyone who had witnessed their story, Margaret's pictures of their early projects, images from their wedding, shots of them teaching workshops and working in the fields. "I wanted you to have a record of what you've accomplished," Ellen explained as they flipped through the albums together. "Someday your children are going to want to know how their parents found each other, and I want them to see the whole story." Samuel paused at a photograph Margaret had taken during their first harvest together. He and Clara were standing in front of a truck loaded with produce, both of them dirty and exhausted, but grinning with the satisfaction of a successful crop. Looking at the image now, he could see what hadn't been obvious to him at the time. They were already falling in love, even if neither had admitted it yet. "Look at us," Clara murmured, studying the same photograph. "We had no idea what we were doing." "We had every idea what we were doing," Samuel corrected. "We were choosing to trust each other, even when we had every reason not to." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of car engines approaching the ranch. Samuel checked his watch, puzzled by the late hour for visitors. As the vehicles came into view, his confusion gave way to alarm. 3 black SUVs were approaching in formation, their official appearance suggesting government business. Samuel and Clara exchanged worried glances. Their operation was entirely legal and above board, but the sudden appearance of what looked like federal agents brought back memories of their earlier vulnerabilities. The lead vehicle stopped near the house, and a woman in a business suit emerged, followed by several other official-looking individuals. But instead of the stern expression Samuel expected, the woman was smiling. "Mr. and Mrs. Crawford, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from the Department of Agriculture. I apologize for the dramatic entrance. My security detail insisted on following standard protocols. I'm hoping you can spare some time to discuss an opportunity that might interest you." What followed was one of the most surreal conversations of Samuel's life. Dr. Chen explained that their ranch had been selected as a model operation for a new federal initiative promoting sustainable agriculture in economically challenged rural areas. The program would provide significant funding and resources to help them expand their educational efforts while documenting their methods for replication elsewhere. "The beauty of your operation," Dr. Chen explained as they toured the facilities by flashlight, "is that it demonstrates how environmental and economic goals can be aligned. You've shown that sustainable practices aren't just good for the land, they're profitable and socially beneficial." The federal recognition represented vindication of everything they'd worked to achieve, but it also brought new responsibilities and expectations. As they discussed the details of the program, Samuel realized that accepting would transform their ranch from a local success story into a national example. "What do you think?" Clara asked after Dr. Chen and her team had departed, leaving them with folders full of information and a decision deadline of 1 week. Samuel looked out over their fields, silver in the moonlight, and thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 3 years ago, he'd been a desperate man about to lose everything his family had built. Clara had been a young woman sacrificing her freedom to save her mother's farm. Neither could have imagined that their arrangement would evolve into a love story, a business success, and now a model for agricultural policy. "I think," Samuel said slowly, "that we've been preparing for this opportunity our whole lives, even when we didn't know it." Clara smiled, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Even when we met under the worst possible circumstances." "Especially then," Samuel replied. "We learned that the most beautiful things can grow from the most challenging beginnings. Maybe that's exactly the message the world needs to hear." 6 months later, the Crawford Hartwell Ranch hosted its first national conference on sustainable agriculture and rural economic development. Over 200 participants from across the country gathered to learn about regenerative farming practices, community partnership models, and the kind of integrated approach to agriculture that Samuel and Clara had pioneered. Standing before the crowd, Clara opened the conference with words that had become their unofficial motto. "Sustainable agriculture isn't just about taking care of the land. It's about taking care of each other, building communities that support both environmental and human flourishing." In the audience, Samuel watched his wife command the attention of agricultural professionals, government officials, and media representatives with the same natural authority she'd shown when explaining soil composition to struggling farmers. Their story had become larger than themselves, a symbol of hope for rural communities and proof that desperate circumstances could be transformed into extraordinary opportunities. But for all the national recognition and professional success, the moments Samuel treasured most were still the quiet ones: morning coffee on the porch, evening walks through their thriving fields, late-night planning sessions for new projects. These intimate moments reminded him that their greatest achievement wasn't the ranch's transformation or their professional recognition, but the family they'd built together from the ashes of their separate losses. As Clara finished her opening remarks and the applause filled the conference tent, Samuel thought about the child growing inside her and the legacy they would pass on. Their children would grow up on land that told the story of redemption and renewal, surrounded by the proof that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. The desperate rancher who had bid on an indentured servant was gone, replaced by a man who had learned that true prosperity came not from owning people or exploiting their desperation, but from creating partnerships built on mutual respect and shared dreams. The frightened young woman who had sold 3 years of her life to save her family's farm had become a leader whose influence reached far beyond their rural county. Together, they had transformed not just a failing ranch, but their own understanding of what was possible when people chose to see beyond their immediate circumstances to the potential for something extraordinary. Their story had come full circle, from desperation to hope, from legal arrangement to love story, from survival to success. And it was only the beginning.